Welcome everyone to our fourth webinar on annual and alternative forage cover crops for grazing. Before we begin, we'll talk about Living Labs. Living Labs is a collaborative project being undertaken by Investment Agriculture Foundation and key partners in the agriculture sector. The BC Living Lab began in summer 2022 and will continue until March 2027. At the heart of Living Lab is a collaborative network of farmers, researchers, agriculture associations, and agriculture and Agri-Food Canada scientists and other specialists involved in the industry. To learn more about the project, visit bclivinglab.ca. Funding for BC Living Lab project has been provided by the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada through Agriculture Climate Solutions Living Lab program. The BC Living Lab project is led by the Investment Agriculture Foundation and is being delivered by the BC Cattlemen Association and the BC Forage Council. Now I'll introduce my counterpart, Karen Raven, to talk about our agenda for this evening.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Wyatt, and welcome everyone. We're really looking forward to this session here with you. So I'll just do this little bit of an agenda overview, then I'll turn it over to Wyatt for the poll. We'll just get a sense of where everybody is from, which has proven really, really interesting to see. And then we'll move to Dr. Gillian Baynard, who will speak to us about the cover crops. I'm really pleased to have her here today. And then we're also fortunate to have Paul Devick of Devick Ranches, and he's one of the mother sites in British Columbia where they're testing between 3 and 4 of these beneficial management practices, and he will speak to us about what their experience with the cover crops and Forage Pro.
I'll now lead the way for our feature speaker, Dr. Gillian Baynard.
Great, thanks so much, and just want to thank everyone for attending today, and thanks to both BC Cattlemen's and BC Forage Council for putting on this webinar series for the BC Living Labs. So I work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I'm a research scientist here, and I've been a scientist with AAFC since about 2017. I've been working in the forage cover crops, polyculture space now for all of those years. And even prior to that as a postdoc. And I'm currently based at the Agassiz Research and Development Center here in BC, which is how I'm involved with the BC Living Labs. But prior to this, I was actually located in Swift Current, Saskatchewan at the AAFC site there. So you'll notice in a lot of my slides today that I have a lot of Saskatchewan examples from my research. So I wanted to set the stage today for what the angle I'm bringing to this research and to this talk. And I'm sure most of you on the call have heard of the idea of regenerative agriculture. And really, this is the space that we're seeing this idea of forage cover cropping taking place. So this is from General Mills. A lot of big companies have adopted regenerative agriculture practices. And really, there's sort of these 5 core I think my cursor is probably on this screen. So to minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, keep the soil covered, maintain living root year round, all of those 4 things can be accomplished with the idea of a cover crop. And when we're working with livestock, we can also hit this 5th piece of integrating livestock. The 6th principle that is often included is just understanding the context of your farm operation. So when I like to define terms, because we do all use them slightly differently, cover crops, right, are traditionally a crop that's not grown for a cash outcome. And they're going to provide some kind of cover for the soil, whether it might have a purpose to reduce erosion or reduce water evaporation loss, might be for weed control. And a lot of them are really for adding back to the soil things like nitrogen. So it might be like a legume cover crop. When we use the word polyculture or polycrop or cocktail mixtures, this one we grow more than one species grown together. And you'll find there's a huge range in this space because some people might say, oh, I have a 2 species mix, which is still a mixture. It's not a monoculture. Often in the regenerative agriculture space, you'll hear about 5, 10, 15, 20 different crops growing together in this mixture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I mentioned, when we look in a forage system, we can actually grow crops that can also then be grazed. So we can look at that in two ways. One way is to actually gain some economic benefit from that crop by having this forage source. And in that way, it could actually be a crop that is baled or actually removed or silaged, removed from the site. But we can also incorporate livestock right onto the farmland and direct graze or swath graze these diverse mixtures. So then the idea being, once you have livestock on this annual cropping land, you have the addition of manure, urea, hoof action to break up plant material, perhaps integrating it into the soil. So that's sort of that extra piece that we can add into the system. And also, just to clarify, today I'm talking really about annual forage crops. So sometimes polycultures, diverse mixtures can also include perennials, but we're really thinking about these annual crops. And if we are thinking in a system that maybe doesn't already have livestock on the land, this might be grown in rotation with other annual crops. And then you would have this sequence or, 1-year growth or possibly shoulder seasons, which we'll talk a little bit about too, where you could grow this crop at a different time from your other cash crops. So what might be included in some of these forage cover crops? We like to talk about functional groups. And functional groups are kind of different groupings of plants based on their additions to a system and what they use in a system. So we can think also of things like cool season grasses versus warm season grasses, right? Providing early season growth versus late season growth. Warm season grasses being things like corn or millet. Legumes are often included for their ability to fix nitrogen. Brassicas are a big one that you're going to hear a lot of talk about. You're going to see them. And the main reason they're included is for their large root structure, potential root structure, which can break up the soil. It can actually break up compaction. If you get really large rooted, deep rooting ones, you can actually see some nutrient scavenging take place. And as that root decomposes, it will leave a big fibrous root mass. And as that degrades, we have the addition of that organic material. And then where the roots were, we actually would anticipate or hope that we would have better soil water infiltration. We also might see other things in this mixture. So often pollinator attractors are included. So on the prairies, often people have sunflowers in their mix. The picture here shows kind of a showy purple flower that's called Phacelia. Phacelia is a very strong pollinator species. It's also considered to be kind of a soil builder. It has a fine root mass sort of near the surface that really helps to aggregate soils. So you'll hear different things included for different reasons. And the idea behind it being that depending what your needs are on your farm, you could kind of play with these mixtures depending on what you need. And then we're going to talk quite a bit about this. Really makes a difference what you want from the forage side of it. So today I want to talk about those things, especially given that we're here with forage and beef people. I want to talk about forage production, but also the nutrition of that forage, the grazing and palatability, kind of some considerations, and then just quickly a little bit about other research. Just the map up at the top there, the little blue star is where I am sitting right now in Agassiz, and the big red star is Swift Current, where most of this research took place. And the red dots are some of the sites where I've also had research trials that you'll hear a bit about. And I know I'm sitting here in the Fraser Valley, which we usually think is very wet, and it has not been. But of course, Swift Current is very semi-arid, and it's in the brown soil zone. And we would actually see quite a bit of similarities probably in terms of climate to interior BC when you get the hot, dry summers. Okay, so let's start by talking about production. So I have little figures and graphs throughout. Don't worry about them too much. Everything I say should explain it. But it is also sometimes nice to have that visual. So the one of the biggest factors behind including these multi-species mixes is that as we have increased biodiversity, you have this idea of improving resiliency and maybe creating more stable yields. Part of the idea is that if something fails, there's something else to take the place of it. We also might see some complementarity. So we could have tall plants and short plants. And as they work together, we can kind of fill that space and presumably increase your yield. And here in this case, I'm talking about yield in a ago now, but looking at growing monocultures all the way up to 12 species together. And you can see by that trend line on these figures that it goes up. So on average, as we increase species number, we did see this increasing trend in biomass production. And the same was true for functional group richness. And to clarify functional groups, as I just introduced earlier, we had up to 4 functional groups, which were cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, and brassicas. Now, what you'll right away see is these lines, as much as there's a trend, there's huge outliers. And so these big monocultures that did really well were things like corn and that just have very big biomass production. And the things that did really poorly are the things that didn't grow that well. So that's why this is definitely on average. And the one thing I always bring up is that production still varies, as with any other crop, with your weather and your climate and your site conditions. And this was just an example of a treatment back to back, way back in 2015 and 2016. You can see the biomass production was almost double from one year to the next. And this was, if you look here, a super dry spring in 2015, well below average. This dotted line here is the 40-year average in Swift Current. And compared to 2016, which was much above average precipitation. So makes sense, your production is going to change. I do like to show this picture. This was from when I grew these mixtures on top of each other 3 years in a row. I had no fertilizer, no inputs. And without any added nitrogen, we really did see over time that this became quite a stressful site. And what I liked about it is it actually did kind of reveal some benefits. So the 8 species mix here versus an oats monoculture, if you look, you can kind of see the oat heads in here. You're also seeing a lot of weeds. Yes, I'm not going to ignore that. And you can see the oats in this picture are much taller. You can see the heads above the horizon there. So we do see having more things in that 8 species mixture are providing some benefits. However, stressful conditions really also reveal risks. And this was a very dry year. And most of what you're seeing in that picture are all weeds. Okay, and this was a grazing trial. So you can see what little crop was there quickly got grazed. And the prairies, as is much of Western Canada right now, undergoing quite a lot of drought-like conditions. And I was just hearing from a producer last week in Saskatchewan that grew a mixture last summer, so 2023, and probably looked very similar to this, had very poor production out of this mixture. So please don't think that because you have all these mixtures, it's just something's going to grow and do better. That might not be the case. So that brings up, what do you see? So the number one question I get asked is like, well, what should I grow? And I'm always like, I don't know, because it really depends what you want, where you live, and what your sort of capacities are. The first caveat I always provide is that the crops recommended by seed companies with the very best intentions, right? They've got, evidence that this crop will do something for you and it's going to grow. Often they don't always grow on everybody's farm. And so that would be a caution I would have for sort of ready-made mixes. And sometimes it might just be based on your soil or even the weather or the climate. And sometimes it could just be even a broader problem with a certain crop. This also introduces the idea of how do you seed crops with different sizes and seeding depths, right? So in this picture, we've got millet, peas, and radishes. Massive differences, right? And the millet's going to need to be quite close to the surface or it won't emerge. But those peas, if you don't sink them pretty deep, they're not going to grow either. So we've tried different things. Honestly, in my research, I often seed things at like an intermediate seeding depth of say like 3/4 inches, which might be borderline deep for some of the small seeded things and borderline shallow for some of the big things. But we've had pretty good uptake with that. I have talked to producers who have done multiple passes. So seed all your big seeds first, come back, seed your small seeds. I've also talked to producers that have kind of put their large seeded things in their, main bin of their seed drill or tank, whatever you're using, and then run the small seeded things out of the fertilizer side bander so that you can place it slightly differently and at a shallower depth. And then the last one, which is maybe the people who are doing this a lot, have actually kind of rigged up their own seeder where they have different boxes and then depending on what the mechanism into the soil is, again, at different depths, so that you reduce those passes, reduce your effort, but increase your chance of getting a good take. And then the last one is, again, mostly from a grazing perspective, that depending on what you seed, you might think, oh, good, I'm going to end up with 50% cereals, 25% legumes, and 25% brassicas. Depending on how things grow, that really might not match up and will have some implications for how you use that as forage. Also recognizing that seeding rates obviously depend on the size and the weight of the seed. So if you're making your own mix, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing just to make sure you're not really heavily applying something that's super small seeded. A little bit about weed control. So this is often one of the marketing high points of these forage cover crops, is that they can help with weed control. And there are some crops that really actually do show strong weed suppression. This was a trial I did looking at a variety of different mixtures, and we also grew them together in a row or separate in a row. So for example, in the picture there with oats and peas, we had oats and peas together or oats and peas intercropped essentially. What we found is there was no difference if they were intercropped or single row cropped. So that was interesting. And then we did see that crops like barley and triticale, those are good weed suppressors. And then things like radish, turnips, the brassicas, they have sort of two modes of potential weed competition. One is they're very big, leafy, relatively aggressive growth, so they can easily shade out other plants. They also have the potential for something called allelopathy, which is when they will release exudates into the soil. That's why when you bite into like a radish and it's spicy, right? That's these secondary compounds. And those are actually part of the plant's sort of protective mechanisms. And so we sometimes suggest that that might be happening. And there's, again, like I said, a couple modes of action. However, I feel like I'm doing like good news, bad news, good news, bad news. There's also a lot of really big risks with weeds. And you saw that in the earlier slide I showed. When you do not have a good cover crop, the weeds are going to be there, right? They're going to be present in your seed bank, at least I'm assuming at most farms. If you're on a farm that uses spray, there are no in-crop herbicide options for most mixtures because you will have both grasses and broadleaf plants. If you are already dealing with this, maybe in an organic system, what we've seen a little bit is this can, if things get out of control, it can really, your chances of having issues following it also increase, right? Because all these seeds go into the soil. So the top picture there is showing a quadrat where we expected there to be crop, and you can kind of see a radish plant here in the middle, some oats or barley up here, and a lot of this is weeds. Kochia, which of course is super bad and starting to show signs of herbicide resistance on the prairies, and things like red root pigweed. Also to recognize that some crops will attract insect pests. I, again, talked to a producer who said, there's no way I'm putting a brassica in there next year because I had such bad flea beetles. And then you might have these little areas where you're kind of encouraging some of these pests. The other picture there, those are blister beetles. I don't know if anyone's had that problem before. They can do a lot of damage on legumes, and sort of a smallish area. But again, if you're encouraging them in an area, that might not be desirable. The other one is disease pressure. Sometimes these crops could actually break a disease cycle. So I'm thinking about soil-borne diseases like root rots, because you're changing what's in the soil. But if you have a legume in a mixture, that still means you have legumes. You might not want to follow as closely with a legume in a rotation if you have a high amount of legumes in your mixture. So just the fact that you have other things in there doesn't necessarily prevent that disease from happening. Okay, I think that's the heart of the production piece with some of the ideas around seeding and weed control. So now let's segue into the animal side of things and talk about nutrition. So the one thing I think that's nice to start with is that forage quality can actually be maintained or improved compared to monocultures. And even when we sort of compare to a traditional sort of hay blend. It really depends on what's in that mixture again. If you include legumes and brassicas, they're very highly digestible. So they have low acid detergent fiber and low neutral detergent fiber, which both show signs of, good digestibility for livestock. With that said, some of them, like especially brassicas, have such high digestibility. They're very watery. And you definitely can run into sort of digestive upset when animals are not used to it, right? Where they will have very runny stools because it is just going right through them. So again, finding that balance of enough roughage with these highly digestible things. Legumes and brassicas are also very high in protein. So you'll often see them sort of, promoted as suitable forages. And there's a couple dangers to that assumption that I'll talk about here. So this is an example of just some of the ways nutrition can change with mixtures. So this was comparing just an oats monoculture, which sometimes people will graze, right, for an annual forage, compared to a 3, 6, or 9 species mixture. And this was one of the trials we grew in Brandon, Manitoba, at the Manitoba Beef and Forage Initiative site. And these little arrows are just showing that in comparison between the monocultures and the mixtures. So we saw higher calcium, higher copper, higher iron, higher nitrogen, that's the TKN, higher phosphorus, higher potassium. And then there's the reduced ADF and NDF, which are those forage fiber values. Asterisks there, importance of a feed test. Like things will definitely be different than what you might be expecting. So that's quite critical to know what's happening. And as I said, I want to highlight brassicas here. So those are the ones that sort of show the biggest divergence from more standard or traditional forage sources. As I mentioned, they have high organic matter digestibility, low fiber. They're also quite high in calcium and phosphorus. So on the in this picture here is a turnip. It's actually called purple top turnip. And you can see it has kind of a reddish purple top. And I will say, because I don't have a slide dedicated to this, in most cases, we're talking about grazing the green above ground biomass. But often if the cattle are pulling on that, they will sometimes uproot the root of a turnip or a radish. Sometimes they're actually kind of high above the ground, kind of sitting there. You've probably seen that. I've not heard any anecdotes about choking risk. And some producers have said, oh, my livestock loved it. They were eating them up. But by and large, what I'm talking about here is the leafy material above ground. So just glance at these figures. This is a trial that had up to 12 species grown in monoculture and up to these 2, 4, 8, and 12 species mixes. The orange bars, the top figures for calcium, bottom figures for phosphorus. The orange bars represent the recommended rate. in feed. So, you don't want to be too much below that, and you don't want to be too much above that. And what you'll see in these red, sorry, they're probably a bit skinny, these red bars. So the area here that's above that orange line for calcium is all the brassica monocultures, and then some of the mixtures that also had brassicas. Same thing for phosphorus. The 4 crops here that are well above that line are all brassicas, and then one that was sorghum and radish growing together. And what happens is we get this calcium to phosphorus ratio that is quite off recommended rates. If it's usually at a ratio of 2 to 1, a lot of these mixtures, and not just from this trial, but from other trials that my colleagues have done, are greater than that upper limit of 4 to 1. Okay, so again, you would want to be supplementing or watching how those rations were working for your livestock. The other real thing with brassicas is that they can have toxic levels of nitrates and sulfur. So this is from one of my colleagues in Swift Current, Alan Iwasa, looked at a bunch of different brassicas grown alone. And you can see the red line is the nitrate safe level, and the blue line is the sulfur safe level. And a lot of these brassicas were quite a bit higher than that. Now, when you're growing them in mixture, that risk goes down, obviously. However, brassicas are very good at regrowing, and they are frost tolerant. So in this picture, you can see in the snow here, everything else is dead and brown. And lo and behold, you have green brassicas growing. So again, what you originally seeded to maybe be a low proportion in a mix might actually be much higher than you're expecting, and you could run into issues with toxicity. This will also make a difference depending on what type of livestock or classification. So for example, I have heard of mortality in calves that were on a high brassica diet. Again, not always sure. We also see crops like oats will accumulate nitrates. So if you had an oats and radish blend, you might actually be making a bigger problem. So lots to consider there. The other one, and you know what, I'll be honest, I don't normally like highlight the toxicity part so much, but this slide kind of came, it's a little bit just anecdotal right now, but heard about some very considerable mortality in a farm in Saskatchewan where they were grazing hairy vetch. So this is a different toxic concern. These are anti-nutritional compounds, particularly in the seeds, and that can cause serious problems and even fatality. So again, and I've put vetch in almost all the mixtures I've grown because it has, high digestibility and high crude protein, but I'm assuming that it's at a very low level. But if you're in a drought and nothing else grew, and let's say hairy vetch for some reason did, you might be running into some issues. So I consider timing of grazing. So in this case, vetch would be bad if you were grazing seeds, the proportion in mixtures, and also that real importance of a feed test. So as I said, I don't normally go on that piece so much, but I feel like it's getting missed a little bit in everyone's so excited about the soil benefits and the production benefits, and then they're like, and I'm going to graze it. And that's where maybe we just need to be a little bit cautious. Okay, so speaking more about grazing and palatability, I won't talk very long here, just comparing a couple different types of trials. So we had a low density grazing trial at Ag Canada and Swift Current with a simple mix that was just oats and peas, and then a complex mix that included those brassicas, hairy vetch, phacelia was in this one. And what we noticed, we were using yearling steers and low grazing pressure. They really avoided the brassicas. They hated them, which you might now, after I scared you, you're like, yay. But when that's what your forage is, they started losing weight when they were on that complex mix. So in this case, they were actually losing up to 4 pounds a day on the complex mix. And my colleagues, I'm not an animal person, I'm a plant person. They were getting so worried, we pulled all the animals off, but we left 3 behind, and those started gaining weight. So they had to get familiar with the forage, and we saw a shift probably In the palatability and the actual flavor, I didn't try them myself, but they are supposed to get sweeter as the season progresses. So that was sort of an interesting example of change over time and sort of awareness. When you have high stocking rates, that's going to become a less of a concern because your livestock are just going to eat what's in front of them. And this was a really nice collaboration I had with a producer, T2 Ranch, Dwayne Thompson, so near Kelleher, not far from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, who runs an intensive rotational grazing operation. So 1,100 cow-calf pairs with bulls. And we had them on this plot that you can see here in the pictures. And you can see they went in the morning, and by early afternoon, they definitely ate the simple mix first. The oats and peas, they were more familiar with it. You can see a lot more of the complex mix standing. But as they stayed out there, the grazing pressure was high enough, they ate and trampled everything equally across that site. Another nice example from Dwayne's farm is that he actually did twice over grazing one year because he had really good spring growth. So the animals came out early July, so well before peak production, let the crops regrow, and he was able to come back in October. I will say again, this is an example of a full season cover crop, so not grown in the shoulders, but specifically for this idea of including in a rotation. With that said, those late season grazing opportunities, we have done trials with swath grazing. Here's some pictures from Bart Lardner at U of S, who I've collaborated with on some of these trials. Depending on your conditions and climate, there's a chance you can grow a shoulder season cover crop. Not as easy in Canada, right? We have shorter growing days, and it's really moisture reliant, but some people will put some of these in, say late August, September, and get enough growth to graze in that sort of late fall. Or potentially, we are also looking at some things for spring growth with winter crops. And then the idea of relay cropping, right? Having something waiting underneath your cash crop that you take off your cash crop and there's something there to graze. Other research, and then I'm wrapping up. So I know whenever we talk, and a huge part of the Living Labs, right, is really what's going on in the soil. What are we finding with soil carbon in particular? And really, this is a huge promotional consideration for growing these forage cover crops, is that we can add biomass, organic material to our soil and hopefully improve soil carbon. It's been really difficult to find this through our trials, partly because we're looking over short time scales, and partly because we find the biggest determining factor seems to be geography, like what type of soil you have, what type of precipitation you have, and things like that. But we do see shifts in soil microbial composition. So the fungal and bacterial partners in the soil will change depending on what you grow, which will have implications for nutrient cycling. At one of our sites, we did see that soil aggregation and infiltration was higher in the mixtures compared to an annual crop, which again is that idea that all those different things breaking up the soil, the different rooting types, the different exudates would all be improving those, the ideas of aggregation and infiltration. But the exact same crops on a different site did not show the same trend. So very variable. A little bit about soil nutrition. This is one where we grew mixtures in year one. The following year, we grew a wheat crop over those same mixtures. And we did see that we had a nitrogen fixing mix, which was all legumes, that had the greatest amount of soil nitrate availability. And we also saw that the more residue we left behind, the more nitrates we had. Sorry, I have my cursor on the wrong screen. So the 100% residue here, so that means we didn't take anything for forage. It was just all left behind. We see this increase in nitrates the following year. Interestingly, total carbon also changed the following year. And this was like, yay, like maybe we're seeing shifts in soil carbon, but the following year it was all gone again. It all was neutral. So you might see blips. And I'm not a soil scientist, but talking with other soil scientists, some of this may be due to the higher availability of nitrates, because you can see the total carbon here is highest under that nitrogen fixing mix. might have actually changed how the plant is using this available nutrients in the soil. And so the sort of conversion or breakdown of soil organic material, those rates also change. So some other things to tease apart there. Just very quickly, new and ongoing research. I still continue working in this space. And the one project I wanted to highlight is a new sort of cross Canada up to Ontario. Sorry, the East Coast isn't on this one, but led by the University of Manitoba and the University of Guelph, funded through the Agri-Science Clusters program. And we are looking at different mixtures so spring seeded for fall grazing, but also fall seeded for spring grazing, like a winter crop. And we're very interested, especially this year, as we've had some wild weather for everyone across the country with low snow in many areas and low insulation for these winter crops, and then also some extreme cold in other areas. One really great part of this is my collaborator, Tristan Skolrud from the University of Saskatchewan, will be conducting a Canada-wide survey sort of on adoption and implementation of forage cover crops. So please watch for that. Obviously, the more people sort of chime in on that, the better picture we can get of things across Canada. So my final thoughts in my final 30 seconds that I'll talk here. I really just want to say there's a lot of potential for these crops, but it can be limited by climate, weather, and site conditions, as with all agriculture. But there are extra management considerations when you grow these crops. As I'm sure Paul can attest to, and other people who have grown these on the line. There are risks with weeds, definite considerations for nutrition. Don't forget to get a feed test. And then the best thing I always say when people ask me, well, what should I grow? I say, well, have you talked to anyone in your area? Because really, that's your best way of knowing, does millet grow where I live? Does kale grow where I live? There are some of these crops that might not be the best fit or might surprise you and be excellent. So it takes a little bit of trial and error, and consider starting small in case you do have something that doesn't maybe work as you expected it to. So with that, I just want to thank primarily all the people in Swift Current who helped me with most of the research you saw today, but also collaborators like Alan and Bart and Aklilu, Dwayne, the producer I talked about. And if you would like to get in touch with me, my contact information is there. And I'm sure Karen and Wyatt can help get you in touch with me as well. So with that, I will end, and thank you very much.
We can introduce to you next Mr. Paul Devick from Devick Ranches. So he's been one of the two producers that within the BC Living Labs that has undertaken to try cover cropping, the mixed cover cropping, and with the Forage Pro. So I will turn it over to Paul, and we've asked him to, for some of you who've seen him on a previous webinar, we still asked him to give us a bit of background on the ranch location and why he chose to implement the cover crops in the Forage Pro, and some of the things that worked really well and some things that you're looking to change in the following year, because it is a bit of trial and error. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul. And then we'll take some questions after. We already have one in the chat, so that's good.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Jillian, too, for your very informative and good work that you do. Anyway, so I'm Paul Devick at Devick's Ranch. We're just north of Kamloops at Heffley Creek. And the picture that you see on the shared screen there is a picture of our project that we've got going. We developed a new field. And on the left-hand side, you'll see our corn crop, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the cover crop project that we are working with. So that field is approximately at 3,000 feet of elevation. So that it's not river bottom or anything, and we did some land clearing on some of it, and other portion of the field was had no forest cover on it and had just open native grasslands. So we developed an irrigation system, and were able to irrigate these crops and carried on with our project. So turning to the cover crop project, which was on the right-hand side of this picture here, we planted Forage Pro mix is what it's called, and it has 9 different varieties in it. It has ryegrass, millet, vetch, clover, radish, turnips, brassica, kale, and beets at differing percentages, everywhere from 5 to 20%. We planted that at 15. There's a sample of the forages that were grown there. The ones on the left were the more predominant ones, down to the ones that didn't do so well on the right-hand side of that slide. I think the one in the tall grain cereal crop in the middle was triticale, which we planted as a cover annual for the Forage Pro as well. And we planted that at 100 pounds with 15 pounds of the Forage Pro mix. And we also added 5 pounds of ryegrass, annual ryegrass, which we know works well. And if something was a failure, we knew we'd still have something. So pretty heavy seeding. I think if we were to do this again next year, we would go to barley, which has a shorter maturity rate, which, I mean, not if, but we will be planting probably barley this coming year to see how that makes a difference at a much less rate, probably down around the 70, 80 pounds per acre instead of 100 pounds per acre. The second one from the left, which is the turnip, I believe, Jillian? Yeah, okay, which is the turnip, was the most noticeable one, which we were very interested in. And if you can turn to that other screen that shows where we grazed, after we grazed, that one right there. You see the white thing in the middle there? That we grazed this after the ground had a few nights of frost, and so the cattle went in and grazed those turnips and chewed the tops right off of them, and I'm sure they would have eaten the whole thing if they could have. So it was quite interesting how the cattle utilized those turnips, and I know I couldn't. Before we turned the cattle in there, we could find these turnips all over the place, and then after grazing, it was all like you see in the picture here, which the cattle just chewed the tops right off of those. There was about half of the turnip was above the ground and half of it was below ground. So we'll get a lot of organic matter and soil amendment improvement from those turnips, as we have from a lot of the other species too. So if you can go back again, Wyatt, for me, please. So yeah, the first 4 or 5 there were the ones that predominantly survived. I think the ones on the left-hand side, I think there's the clover and the vetch. We had a hard time finding them. They didn't survive, whether that was from the too much seeding of the triticale, I'm not sure, or maybe next year we'll find out if we go with the barley and we take our silage crop off first a little earlier, then there might be a little bit more of that vetch and clover survival. I have to also say that we fertilized that whole mix with 200 pounds of 40-00 nitrogen mix, and we seeded it at about 3/4 of an inch of depth. I think that's the main things I wanted to say. We turned the cattle in after, like I say, after the first few frosts, And maybe you can go to that slide where it shows the cattle, Wyatt. There it is there. That's the field. And as you can see, we had, at one point, we had a little bit of snow cover, and then it all disappeared. But that's the field after about 4 or 5 days of grazing. We had 300 cows in there. Young mother cows were in on 20 acres, and the regrowth was probably an average of, I would say, 10 to 12 inches in height over the whole 20 acres. And the 300 cows lasted pretty close to a week in that section of the field. And after we did that, we started feeding them, moving them into our corn plots, which was talked about in one of the previous seminars. Was it last week or the week before? I forget which, but anyway, so that's the same bunch of cows, and we moved them through to that. We did supplement with a minimal amount of hay, good alfalfa hay, while the cattle were grazing there, just so we didn't get any extreme acidosis or anything. But the cattle did very well for that week. They were definitely happy cows. They had lots to eat, and they were on a new diet that they've never seen before. So they were happy. So having said that, I think that's all I've got to say. We will, like I say, next year be switching from triticale to barley, and reducing the rate of that down to about 80 pounds to give the Forage Pro more of a chance to germinate and regrow after we take the silage crop off. So that was most of our findings, and yeah, other than that, I'll take questions after when Wyatt and Karen introduce the questions.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Paul. That was terrific. Really appreciate the details about what you tried and what worked well and what you'd like to change. We do have 2 questions in the chat. The first question is from Mike Malmberg. Can you supplement appropriate minerals economically in brackets to address deficiencies when brassicas fail or are not included in the mixtures? And I'll just, Jillian, is that something you want to address, or do you want that to go to Paul?
Well, if Paul has any advice, certainly jump in. And I'm not an animal nutritionist, so I have to confess I'm not super well versed in how much of supplementation is needed. When I saw your question, I looked back on my slide with phosphorus, and I think like a lot of most of the different things I grew and most of the mixtures were in that good range, right in the middle. And then there was a few that were low, was like millet, corn, those warm season ones, corn and barley, and then the high were the brassicas. So I think it would all just depend on your feed test, of course, and what level of phosphorus is there. But from what I can see there, it doesn't look like you would need to supplement super high to bump that up if it was lower. But that's kind of the best I can give, as that's not my area of expertise. Sorry.
Yeah, and I can say that we did not supplement anything. And if the cattle tell you anything, the cattle did well. So supplementing maybe would have been better, but not necessary as far as we're concerned.
That's a really good point, especially if they're grazing it for a short amount of time, right? And like you said, you had your hay there as well. So it might not be as really a concern for a short grazing time.
Great, thank you both for that. The next question comes from Carissa Wilcox. How do you determine seeding rates with more complex mixtures?
This is a fun one, especially if you don't like math. That's like me. I've done it 2 ways. So the one way is to take your crop, and you know what? This is oddly hard to find sometimes, but find your recommended seeding rate for a monoculture, right? And then say, okay, well, I want that to be 10% of my field. So then you would take that monoculture rate and divide by 10 to get your down to 10%. And then you kind of do that for each crop in your mix so that you kind of are adding up to what presumably should be, you know, a reasonable seeding rate across that mix. The trick is that you might not just be aiming for 100%, right? There might be some variation in there. So the other thing that I do as a researcher, especially for small plot trials, and it's a little more tedious, but I actually work backwards from what I would literally count. Like, so if I think, okay, if I've got a square foot or square meter, whatever units you want to use, and look at okay, normally, you know, especially things like corn, you know, you don't want very many per square meter. With quick side note, corn doesn't like being in mixtures very well. It will always be on the edges where it can grow and outcompete others with space. So I can't say that's super great in these mixes, but then I would look. So if I'd say, okay, if I want in this area, I would like to see, you know, 20 barley plants and 30 peas. I mean, you could make it up, right? And then you scale up on your from that very small unit up to field scale size. And you could actually kind of compare if you did the sort of take your monoculture seeding rate, divide by 10, and then versus what you would actually see growing. It's not difficult math. It's just a little bit tedious, but allows you to really visualize. And honestly, I would highly recommend doing something like that than to take a ready-made mix, and that you might just not know what quite, when they give you a seeding rate, quite what each piece in there is going to come out as. But yeah, the more you have in your mix, the more complicated it gets, which I did not talk about. And if people on the call write in the chat or in the question and answer, love to hear the number of things you're growing. Honestly, the 12 species mix is the highest I've grown. And I would say it was functioning more as like an 8 species mix. And what I mean to say is that 2 or 3 things didn't grow and 2 or 3 things were pretty much the same. So they didn't, it didn't look like 12 species in the end. So these people talking about 18, 20, 24, I'd be curious to know how much that diversity is adding to the system, but you'll hear all kinds of viewpoints on that for sure.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, the importance of knowing your numbers of seed, the weight of your seed in your mix. So like, I mean, if you compare say peas to what's some of the other tiny ones, like a millet or something like that, you get so many more seeds per pound of them, and that's the important factor, is the number of seeds in 1 pound of the mono, like Jillian said, and then you work from there. I think in our 9 seed mix, we'll do it again this year to see if our annual crop, the grain cover on that annual cover crop is going to make a difference with the same seed mix. But I think if in another year, I would like to reduce that down to maybe take as much as I like clover and vetch in the mix, maybe take those out if they can't compete. So I agree with Jillian totally. When you get these big mixes with so many different species in it, it's hard to tell why the success or the failure, whatever you want to call it, of certain things, why they happen.
Yeah. And I'll say too, the one interesting one is the clovers. Like, we all want legumes. And then I was like, hairy vetch is toxic. And peas are safe and standard, but it's really hard to find a good annual clover. Like the one you had, Paul, I'm trying to remember, was it Berseem clover?
Oh, now you're really testing me.
Okay.
I don't have the label in front of me, but yeah.
No, that's okay. Like, it's one that sometimes or even the red clover grows great for some people and terrible for others. So that can be a tricky one to actually see in a mix, I guess, is sort of where I was just following up.
I can also add something that I missed in my talk, that we did irrigate that land fairly heavily. We have a gun traveling gun system, and we irrigated that 4 or 5 times over the season with the traveling gun, and 2 days on each set. So it got lots of water.
Yeah, that helps.
Okay. Thank
Karen,
you.
can
We
I
have,
quickly do the last question?
I was just going to say we have 1 minute to go, but we don't want
Yeah,
to leave it on the
I'll do it.
table there. If you could do that
Yeah,
and address that, that would be fantastic.
for
And
sure.
then,
And I don't have a good answer, so I can probably be quick. John asks how to manage allelopathy, especially for something like radishes or brassicas. Has this competition been accounted for? Can we expect a certain % loss, or is this no big deal? So it's interesting because we say, oh, brassicas might have this allelopathic potential, which is great for weed control, but it also probably will be creating a bit of competition for your crops and your mixture as well. So I do not know of any way to account for that or to manage it, so to speak. And so I would say it's probably your second comment of no big deal is kind of where I see it landing, but also then recognizing if you have a super high brassica mix, you might see them becoming even more aggressive or outcompeting some of those other crops that are more sensitive. So again, I think keeping those brassicas at a reasonable rate, unless that's like your number one thing is like, I need to break up this hard pan and I'm going to grow tillage radish, which tillage radish can get roots like as big as my arm. I have never grown them that big myself, but so if that's your goal, grow all that radish, sure, but don't graze it. And then maybe be prepared that you might have really good weed control that year, but if it's in mixture, you might have some in intra-specific competition or inter-specific competition as well.
great. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much. That was just so interesting what you both shared with us, and for the interesting questions coming from the audience. I'll just get Wyatt to bring up the last slide, and it was nice with some of the questions that touched on it, because for our last webinar, we're going to have Dr. Bart Lardner from University of Saskatchewan tie it all together, because a lot of folks, when you're looking to make these changes, as the Devics did and others, what are those nutritional considerations as you're moving into trying these practices, things to consider and things to manage for. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. And I'll turn it over to Wyatt to give some closing comments and the thank yous. And thanks again, everyone. It's been a pleasure to have you on part of these webinars.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. As was mentioned, I want to thank Dr. Jillian Bernard and Paul for agreeing to sit on this call with us. And yeah, I think it was a great discussion today. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing everyone, same place, same time, same Zoom link. We'll see you all next week. Thank you.